Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio. The multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.
All right, welcome back. Now, as you know, we often discuss very difficult topics on the show, such as the mother and baby homes and stuff like that. And I certainly don't want to shy away from topics like that from Ireland's past. But collectively, have we really examined such atrocities? And, have we examined our past in a way that is helpful? Or do we just look back at things like the laundries, the industrial schools, with a shudder and think, that was the way it was then and this is the way it is now, and sure, it was all the church's fault anyway. But the truth is that for things like the laundries to occur, a lot of people had to allow them to happen. And I'll give you an example. I was born in a mother and baby home in St. Patrick's Road or St. Patrick's Home in the Navan Road. And somebody told me at the time that one of the local Garda Síochána had said to his sergeant, do you think we should go over there and see what's going on? Because I'm hearing a few stories about stuff that's going on in that home. And the sergeant said, no, she'll just leave. They know what they're doing over there. Leave them to it. Now, this is back in the 1960s, of course, when the priests and the hierarchy of the church were seen as, these pillars of society. But a lot of people were involved in what went on in Ireland, not just the church, the state, and I suppose the people to some degree too, when we talk about, mothers who went into those homes. Yes, there was a moral standard in society where the parish priest would come knocking on your door if your 16-year-old was pregnant and say, get her down to that laundry because you're not going to bring a baby into this village to an unmarried mother, an illegitimate child, or a bastard, as they would have been referred to it at the time. I'm sorry to use the language, but that was the language that was used. But what about the Irish psyche? Did that contribute to the horrors of the past? And how did we deal with that? Well, one author and journalist who spent a lot of time thinking about these things is Derek Scally. Derek is an Irish Times correspondent, normally based in Berlin. A couple of years ago, he realised the fascinating, or should I say released the fascinating best-selling book called The Best Catholics in the World. And he joins me now to talk about it and how his life in Berlin informed his way of thinking about Ireland's past. Good evening to you, Derek.
Good evening to you, and thanks for having me on.
Now, Derek, I suppose it's very difficult to ignore the fact that it was the Catholic Church that primarily were responsible for not just the acts that happened with laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools, just the national schools themselves where, a lot of children were abused. And yes, it's very easy for us just to say it was their fault. But your argument is that we allowed that to happen. But did we not allow it because we were told we had to allow it?
I would start with, who do we mean when we talk about the church? I've often been fascinated, particularly writing this book, is that people talk about the church as if it is a spaceship, and this spaceship landed in Ireland, and these sort of lizard people that looked like us came out and they enslaved us and they forced us to do stuff we didn't want to do, and now we've beaten them back into the spaceship. They've taken off, and that was a terrible time, but isn't it great that we got rid of them? Every priest, every bishop, every nun who did good things or bad things to people in Ireland is an Irish passport holder, is a person who was born and raised in this state, is a part of the system church, of course, a clerical tower of, untouchable people that you could not question. But they were also products of Ireland. They were people, they were Irish people. And a few years ago, before all this nastiness came out, we were very proud of them. They were our missionaries. They're going around the world to places like Australia and elsewhere. But there was a huge pride in them here. But as soon, in the late 90s, when all this started to come out, we sort of flipped the narrative, and suddenly it was them. They did this to us.
But that's because we were horrified by the Ryan report, the Murphy report, the Klein report. We were horrified by report after report after report as to what they did. And it wasn't just because I don't buy into the argument that every priest is a paedophile, because that certainly is the case. It was a very small percentage.
Yes.
But it wasn't the paedophiles. It wasn't the ones that abused the children. It was the other ones who knew what they were doing and stood idly by and let them do it. And with that famous story of Cardinal Brady, who claimed he was the note taker during an interview in relation to Brendan Smith, who had abused children. But the argument that I was only a note taker, you sat there, you listened to the testimony of that young child, and you did nothing. Isn't that the real crux of it?
Would anyone else in Ireland at that point have done anything? Would a police officer have done anything? Would a social worker have done anything? And with Cardinal Brady, obviously he rose to a high position. At the time he was a curate, and maybe had ideas about climbing up in the church. And I think people are provoked by Cardinal Brady because he really exemplified, it was the perfect storm of sort of clerical we are better, we play by our own rules. But the longer I talked about Cardinal Brady, the more I realised I think he's also a provocation, because in our hearts, many people who would have been living in the 1970s in Ireland, they know they wouldn't have done any different. And that's the ultimate shame, is that they were never they were always us.
But is that because that we lived by the morals of this same Catholic Church? And I gave an example in the introduction. So, in, say, a rural town in Ireland, a young girl gets pregnant at 16 years of age. The parish priest is literally best friends with them. Well, he's best friends with everybody in the village, and kind of saying, you better get her down to a laundry, because we can't have a young girl unmarried out of wedlock wheeling a buggy through the village.
Well, that's
and
one
so
way.
they felt they had, the parents, although they're responsible because they put her in the laundry or put her into the mother and baby home, they felt they had to do it.
Well, that's gets to the nub of the book. Isn't it a tragedy that we were living in a country where a family had to decide between the reputation of the family or the welfare of one of their family members? And collectively, that family would have been ruined in many towns if they had kept that daughter. If they decided for their daughter, the entire village would condemn the family. And it's not just the priest. You can say the priest was the ringleader. You can say the priest was the lead bully if you take it like a schoolyard. But a bully has other people helping him. The people who won't serve them in the shop. The people in the post office who won't redirect their phone calls. So
that's because they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, pardon the pun.
Of course, but where are all those other people who were sort of the if we go along with your thesis that the priest was the ringleader in all this, where are all the enablers?
Well, no, not the priest. I'm not saying the priest himself as an individual was the ringleader, but the teachings of the church at that particular time. I mean, nowadays the church still teaches that it's wrong to have a child out of wedlock. It still teaches that you're not supposed to have sex for entertainment or enjoyment. You're
Yes.
supposed to be for procreation. They still teach all of those things, but we're more a la carte in the way we receive that information now.
But the question
Whereas
is,
when you go back
why
in time,
were we
people
trying to be
weren't
the
a la
best
carte.
Catholics in the world back in the day? The interesting thing was, if you go to other countries that were also very Catholic in South America and elsewhere, they weren't locking up their daughters in laundries. We were trying, I think, in the book I kind of explore, where did our Irish Catholicism come from? We always think it goes back to St. Patrick, and I say, no, that's not true. It started in 1850. After the trauma of the famine, we tried to create this perfect, ideal Catholic identity, and sort of the trauma, the Catholic Church came along and tried to give people a sense of pride, a sense of this wasn't all meaningless. Salvation, we have suffered greatly, but that makes us even holier. And they created an ideal version of Ireland, and this had to be preserved at all costs. So if a young girl got pregnant, that was a contradiction to who we wanted to be in the post-famine era, and we created this sort of Victorian prudery and nastiness that you don't get in other countries' Catholicism. We seem to think we're the origin of the species, but the type of Catholicism, the type of judgmentalism, the type of life-destroying destruction used with the label Catholic on it, that is something that's uniquely Irish. You saw it in some countries, but never as deep and never as nasty, and didn't last as long. So you have to ask, when you look at Irish Catholic, I think you need to emphasize the word Irish as well as Catholic, because if we don't do that, what we're going to say is, we can say, oh, we're not those people anymore. We are those people. We always were those people. We did this to ourselves. And I think if we say those priests did things, or they started
What
things.
you're saying, we did this to ourselves. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
You. When you say, it almost sounds like, and I'm certainly not suggesting, but I know there are people listening that will say, well, Derek is just being an apologist now for the church. And I'm not suggesting you are, because I think you're explaining your point very well. But when you say that we did this to ourselves, we didn't. I don't believe we did. I believe we basically became part of, I'm not going to use the word cult, but we talked about cults the other night, which is a way of thinking, a mass way of thinking, because we're told this is the right way to think. You're not supposed to think outside of that. This is the way you think. So in other words, if your daughter gets pregnant, or indeed if, as I mentioned, the Department of Education had written a letter to the Minister for Justice back in 1940, the letter was printed in the Irish Independent, going back not so long ago there. It could have been the Irish Times, actually. And it was, that this minister had caught a woman up a lane at 16 years of age, fornicating and acting like a common prostitute. She should immediately be put into a Magdalen laundry. That was the way we were told that society should operate. we didn't decide that. Just
Were
like
we children?
during COVID, we were told,
children? Had we no? I like to think of it. Did nobody have any free will? Was nobody?
But we
did
don't
nobody have any
sometimes,
power? I think we have this binary. We had religious people, and then we had the enslaved Irish, which is like we're almost referring to them as like our English overlords. We're using the same logic. In my book, I talk about we have in one corner. Think of it as a continuum. We have perpetrators and enablers, bishops, priests, religious in one corner, and in the other end of this continuum, we have victims and survivors, and everyone else in Ireland has to place themselves on that sliding scale. The idea that nobody could do anything, nobody could say anything. There's a film running in the IFI about people in Navan who stood up to people, stood up to bullies in convents and in mother and baby homes. They stood up, other people didn't, and I think many people are slightly embarrassed in hindsight. They didn't stood up if they had the option. Many people didn't have the option. I'm not saying everyone could, but many people are embarrassed that they didn't, and I think many people are embarrassed that they put these priests and bishops and nuns up on a pedestal, and in hindsight they're wondering, why did I put them up on a pedestal? Because from many of their behaviour they clearly don't belong on that pedestal, and there's a certain angriness at themselves. Why did we go along with certain things? Why were we so foolish? Why were we that person? Why was I that person in the 70s or 80s that I was? How do I explain that to myself? I'll give you an example. It involves the Navan Road. It involves the mother and baby home on the Navan Road. When I was in a taxi going to Áras an Uachtaráin, there was an event for the Magdalene, so-called Magdalene women. Michael D. Higgins was inviting them in to say, this was not your shame, what we did. What we did to you was our shame as a people. The taxi driver used to have, he worked for a company that had a contract with the Eastern Health Board, ferrying women from that home to St. James's Hospital at Euston Station. He would drive them back and forth, pregnant women in the back. He would occasionally stop off at a newsagent and buy them cigarettes at different times. But he says in hindsight to me in the taxi, he said, I never really talked to them. I never really felt that I could. And he said he stopped off once to buy cigarettes for one of these women. And one of the other taxi drivers saw him in the shop and said, why are you buying cigarettes? You don't smoke. And he said, oh, it's for the women in the back. And he said, oh, you don't want to be dealing with scum like that. So he says to me, I'm not sure whether I could have done anything. I had to pay off a mortgage and this was my job. But those women were clearly not there of their own free will. So he has nowhere to go with that. Yeah.
And the state, so you believe obviously the state had responsibility, had to wash their hands with responsibility of society, particularly for young women.
The state is also people, Irish people we elect. The state is not an alien
I know,
body. We are the state,
like
we are
mother,
the church,
for
and we always were. And I think we just make things a little bit simpler. It reminds me of sort of angry teenagers fighting back against their parents. Eventually we have to grow up and realise that a priest who did something to a woman was an Irish man attacking an Irish woman, and we can dress it up. There are certain particular categories with clerics and power and so on, but eventually it was just a man attacking a woman and a conspiracy and collusion in a village to make that happen. I spoke to women who were put into laundries, or a woman who checked herself into a mother and baby home on the Navan Road because she said, I had nowhere else to go. No one in my parish wanted to help me. And she's not saying that the nuns were any better, but that's how Ireland operated. And there's terrible...
It was for financial reasons. My own mother, for example, I was born on the Navan Road, and I spent 15, 16 months of my life there. But my own mother, I had to leave after I was born. But she couldn't take me home because she financially didn't have the resources to do so. We didn't bring in social welfare or single parent payments probably till later on. This is back in 1963.
Yes.
So the state then has to hold some responsibility, because in the Constitution it clearly states, which by the way they're trying to remove from the Constitution now, and I think we should just change the gender in it, maybe, or de-gender it, but they are trying to take this protection away, that no woman should have to go to work to raise her children or to get money to raise her children. So the state broke its own rules of the Constitution by allowing women to go into these homes in the first place and have to give up their children by necessitation of having no money.
But the question is, was the church dictating how the Irish state should be, or was the state colluding with the church to create an ideal state which they thought was ideal, which for women was anything but ideal? At the end of the day, it's about men bullying women. A lot of this is about men bullying women. You can dress it up and say it was a priest. You can dress it up and say it was a bishop. But I met so many women on this journey who are carrying such pain with them. A cutting remark. They weren't put in a home, but they were just bullied by priests or bishops.
They were bullied by nuns too. So there was women bullying women too.
And I will say, as you said rightly at the start, 89% or 98% did good, and I think it's a real tragedy if you're a 70 or 80-year-old priest now and people are looking at you sideways thinking, is he a bit funny? And they've devoted their life to service to this country. It's very unfair for them to think that everything has been dumped on their watch. I mean, if you wanted to be really,
is it outdated? Sorry, just to
Yeah.
interrupt you again. Is it outdated, the idea of a man, particularly, right? Because obviously men have testosterone. But is it outdated, the idea of a man living a celibate life and dedicated his life to God, whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God? Is it an outdated concept? Is that concept outdated now in a modern world?
I'm not qualified to say. I think anyone who went into seminary back in the 50s or 60s, sex was such a taboo. I don't even think they knew themselves what they were going in there, and sex certainly wasn't mentioned during their training. They claim it is now, but yeah, celibacy is something people apparently go in of their own free will, and it is a gift, and it allows them to dedicate their life to service. I think most people have made up their own minds what they think of that at this stage.
I mean, look, it's not just an Irish problem. It's a worldwide problem. And obviously you, when you lived in Berlin, looked at how the Germans tackled, I suppose, their own
Exactly.
guilt, for what happened in the war. But do you believe that we're handling it as well as they are? Because I find, and I know the Germans are still paying out billions in compensation every single year to people who had been in concentration camps or relatives of people who had been in concentration camps, including grandchildren. So they're still paying the debt to society. We're still paying it because we have redress schemes set up, and I'm only one more recently now that they're waiting patiently for the redress for the mother and baby homes. Will we be paying forever? Or at some point do we have to accept that was the past and move on to the future?
Well, in the book, I focus a little bit more on East Germany because it's a bit closer, and I don't really ever compare what they did and what we did. I look at, are we prepared to accept that we have responsibility to our past? And I would also say a financial responsibility. I'm not sure if you can ever draw a line under these things. I think the trouble now is that these women, many of these women and the friends and allies they have volunteering to help them, they don't actually have any support. So they were expected to work for free in a laundry. They have no pension, they have nothing else. And now they're expected to fight for their rights. What I would like to see is that there's full-time people working like an ombudsperson, especially dealing with their needs, that can help them look at what are they entitled to, what welfare payments are they entitled to, what help do they need, because the Irish society that ignored them back then is ignoring them now. So if we have learned so much, why are women, elderly women who were in laundries, why are they still fighting for the basics to survive? And
we're failing quite miserably in dealing with that. And I don't know whether that's a
why
human
so much
failure.
apathy? I mean, I think in Ireland we're very good at sympathy. Somebody goes on the Late Late Show or one of these talk shows and they tell their story and everyone says, oh, isn't that terrible? And then we'll go to a break and we'll forget about them again. Why? I think if we actually engage with the pain that they went through, we would have a real empathy for them, and we would want to improve their lives, what's left of their lives. Instead, we blame priests. We say it was terrible what they did to those people, those poor women. We're not even viewing them as real Irish citizens, because if we were, we would realise they're entitled to a pension, they're entitled to basic welfare, they're entitled to more than just an apology and a day out in Áras an Uachtaráin. We're entitled to do something that will make them feel good about themselves, not us try to do things that will make us feel good about ourselves. And I don't think if we actually entered that space, that headspace, and met them as one-to-one, we would actually realise that we're trying to get away from ourselves. We had stage 1 was the paedophile priests. Stage 2 was the bishops who moved them around. Stage 3 was church-state collusion. And I wrote this book because I said it's time we moved on to stage 4. The largest group in Ireland at that time and today is us. We were in the middle between the extremes, the perpetrators and the victims and survivors. And we have to locate ourselves there. Could I have done anything? Did I see anything? Did I want to know? Did I not want to know? Am I dealing with a real sadness, like that taxi driver who says, could I have done something? Should I have done something? Do I have to?
Well, we addressed that in 2012 with the Criminal Justice Act and when we amended the Criminal Justice Bill to suggest that if anybody was aware that a child's life was in danger or their safety was in danger, they too could be responsible and obviously go to jail. So we did amend that. That was in and around the time when I remember the big debate from Cardinal Brady was in relation to the sacrament of confession. I'm sure you remember that big debate at the time because Sutton still said he stood over the sacrament of confession, and they gave the kind of red herring story that if somebody came in and said they had abused a child, would he tell the police? And he said no, because it's sacrosanct. So it seems that the general public and the state wanted to learn something from the mistakes of the past and put it right in 2012. You may correct me on that. I think it was 2012. But the church still didn't want to make it right and still hung on to this, the sacrament of confession, for example. And I know it's a bit of a red herring story, but there was one case in Australia where a priest had gone to another priest, gave a confession. He didn't report to the police. The guy went on to abuse 30 or 40 children or something like that. I can't remember the exact story. So there had been one or two cases of this. So do you believe the church has learned from the past, from its own mistakes of the past?
The church
I'm not saying there wasn't people involved. There is other people involved.
I
but
think
its own mistakes.
If you the church will get away with what the church will get away with, like any institution. And I would ask the question, if people are angry at what the church has continued to get away with, whether it's paying into redress funds, whether it's locking up files and not allowing people to have access to them, why do people just sit back and let them get away with it? I think there is still an unwillingness or a feeling among most Irish people that they cannot challenge priests, they cannot challenge bishops, because people complain about it, a bit like they complain about taxi drivers to their friends. But you ask, did you ever challenge the taxi driver? And I think people in Ireland are still afraid of authority. You see it with certain senior civil servants. You see it with hospital consultants. People are still afraid of authority. They're afraid of challenging authority. And if people are
that's
so
because
upset
we
about,
believe they know best.
if
don't
people,
we?
of course, but well, then you're just being foolish again. If you think these people know best, there's a line in the Murphy report about abuse in the Dublin Archdiocese, and it is a brilliant phrase. And she said, the Irish people showed undue deference to the Catholic Church and its senior clerics. Undue deference. And that is something every Irish person needs to reflect on. Why did we show them such deference? Because it was certainly undue. We know that now. And how do we feel about that knowing now, and maybe half knowing back then, that this bishop or this priest was a fool or a bully, but we didn't feel able to challenge. And it's very painful. It's really painful, and particularly for older Irish people. I was born in 1977. I would never judge somebody who grew up in the 40s or 50s or 60s. You really did not challenge a priest or a bishop. But you could see injustice happening, perhaps, and you are maybe these days really frustrated and upset. I'll ask you a personal question now. Are you more upset at the church, at what your mother went through, or at the society that allowed the church to do what it did to your mother? That's the question.
I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah,
I do believe it's partly of society, partly the state washing its hands with the responsibility of not only in relation to mother and baby homes and laundries, but the state watches its responsibility with education and handed that over to the Catholic Church as well. Everything was handed over, and I think it suited the state to do that at the time. So they do have to take 50% of the responsibility.
And women bore the brunt of everything, and men just walked away.
Well, in a lot of the cases, yes, absolutely. They did. And that question is never asked, and is rarely asked when we've had conversations on the show where I've had women crying on the air because they gave up their child in either illegal adoptions or coerced adoptions.
Yes.
Nobody ever says, where was the father of the child? And nobody ever says that.
Yes.
And you are right. That's an important issue. They walked away. And in a lot of cases, they may have been relations. We don't know. It was a very different society, too.
Actually, I've made some extraordinary stories where the men actually wanted to stand by the woman, but because they weren't married, the village colluded to separate them. It was almost like Romeo and Juliet, and they never got to back together again, and they were being told different things. So the man wanted to stand by the woman. I have heard these stories. I put out a request via the Irish Times. I said, where are the Magdalene men? I want to talk to the Magdalene men. And I got 2 or 3 stories, mostly from the children of these men and the women, obviously. And they said, yeah, in one case, it was the families actually kept them apart because this could not happen. This unmarried couple could not have a child. We need to stop this. The shame is too great. And so there's all sorts of stories, all sorts of untold stories. And I really think we would like this to be over. And I know it's exhausting to talk about it all the time. But the largest group of people in Ireland during the dark old days of Catholic Ireland was us. Even if you disagree that we weren't the Catholic Church and we weren't the priests and we weren't the victims, but the largest group, the group that I was actually able to do something, that was us. But we didn't feel power to do so.
You could liken that to Germany when Hitler, of course, and going back a long way. I don't know whether this is part of what you said in the book as well. But when you go back in time and when Hitler ordered the extermination of Jewish people, I mean, German people didn't object to it at the time. They weren't out protesting on the streets. They weren't disgusted and horrified by it. They allowed it to happen because they thought he knew best. And that was the way it was there too. I mean, should we be horrified at all the German people who were alive at that time and allow that to happen and didn't, stand up against the German government?
No,
at the
you
time?
ask yourself, this is obviously, we're moving into territory. I don't make these comparisons in my book between Nazi Germany and Catholic
No,
Ireland.
of course.
But I think living in Germany, I always ask myself the question, I wonder how brave you would have been, Derek. And I think if I'm very honest with myself, the answer is probably not very much. Most people want a quiet life. Most people keep their head down. When shit starts happening, they just want it to go away. They want to raise their kids. They want to have a happy life. And if a society picks on a certain group of random people, whether they're Jews, whether they're women, whether they're homosexuals, and they decide, oh, we have our scapegoat, let's just go to town on them, the rest of society will tend to look away. And the powers that be, whether it's a dictatorship or a totalitarian theocracy, which many people would say Ireland was, they will experiment to see how far can we go. In Germany, there was a huge protest when they started euthanizing people with mental and physical handicaps. So they realized, all right, we can't, that won't be our test group. So then they moved on to Jews, and there was a huge cultural antipathy towards Jews around the world. Germany was no exception. In Ireland, there was huge, tremendous, very ugly anti-Semitism. So they tapped into something that was already there. They injected in the steroids, and we ended up with the Holocaust. But most people are not brave, and most of us are not heroes. And acknowledging that in hindsight is what I'm trying to do in the book. And where do you go with that?
People try and stand up. When we see what they call mass formation, which is everybody accepting something that's kind of wrong sometimes, on a mass level, because they're told by higher authorities, that this is the right thing to do. Did people stand up? And I'll give you an example, and it's not a very good analogy, but it is an analogy of sorts. During the 2 years of COVID-19, some silly rules were brought in. There's no doubt now, when we look back retrospectively at it, some of the silly rules that were brought in, this kind of €9 meal and all that kind of thing. But people conform to it. More recently, there's more evidence out now to suggest that masks didn't really make much of a difference. We've even got rid of them in hospitals in the last week now. That they didn't really make that much of a difference because people weren't wearing them properly. They were fiddling with them and everything else. But yet there was mass formation, whereas if somebody didn't wear a mask, they were almost attacked. And do you understand what they're called by mass formation? In other words, society are told, this is the way you should behave. So in other words, and I'm coming back to what I started with, the start is, I'm trying to take some of the responsibility away from us for allowing things to happen that shouldn't have happened, because maybe we didn't stand up. During COVID, we saw some people did stand up and say something, but they were immediately cancelled or shut down. There were doctors who stood up and said, this isn't really right, I don't agree with it. They were fired. The HSE dropped them or forced them to resign. So is that what would have happened, then as well?
Well, I think, particularly at a time of crisis, there's safety in numbers, and people like to think they're in the right group, and it's safer to be in the large group than in being a minority. Interestingly, well, first of all, the jury is still out on masks. We will probably never know for sure. I think most people with masks said, well, it's annoying, but it's not the end of the world, so I'll just wear it. But in Sweden, it was the exact opposite. If you wore a mask in Sweden, you were attacked. So it was literally like Alice through the looking glass. So I think people just prefer, when people are afraid, they're very malleable. And I think people were very, very afraid. And
fear, is that what it is? I mean, when we look back at the 60s and 70s.
Fear, insecurity, scapegoat. I think you can...
So did the church put fear into people and say, well, if you don't do what we said, you're a sinner and you're going to go to hell?
I think... we were dealing with post-famine trauma. I think that's, we didn't even have a word for trauma back then. Psychotherapy did not exist. The church came in just as the English state, the British state was retreating, and they came up with this idea of, they offered consolation and desolation, and people were just destroyed after the famine. And I think the church moved in quite quickly, as often religious organizations do after a natural disaster, and they built something that looked great. They had schools, they had hospitals, the Irish state was going places. The state, the new Irish independent state 100 years ago, did a Faustian deal with them. They allowed them to run the schools, to run the hospitals at low cost, but with full control. We know in hindsight that was a mistake in many respects. But people were just traumatized. People were afraid. It was an authoritarian time. People were used to being talked down to. And I think it's only, the irony is that the Catholic Church educated many of us to think beyond what we saw them teaching us, and educated us to a point where we could stand up. And the many of the, if you look at many of the loudest, proudest campaigners against, on behalf of the Magdalene women and so on, they're all girls from convent schools, and mostly it's women, who fought back. So actually, they gave us the tools to actually fight them back, prune them back to the position where they find themselves in Irish society today, where most people would say religion, fine, but it is a private matter. It is not no longer how we run our state.
I mean, I know you kind of travel the length and breadth of Ireland and across Europe, going to masses, novenas, shrines, and seminaries, talking to those who have abandoned the church. And there's no doubt that people have, well, maybe not abandoned the church, because we talk about the church as being, a follower of God, not necessarily going into a physical building, but abandon the physical buildings, I suppose, or abandon that way of praying. Do you think that there was a lot of damage done to the Catholic Church, not just by the fact that young people nowadays are a lot more educated and less believe in God, I suppose, but do you think that they were damaged an awful lot by the reports that people did turn away or turn against the church? Because there was a report out, I think in around 2014, and it was talking about religiosity around the world. And in America, ironically enough, was the only place where belief in religion had gone up in the southern states, whereas in Ireland, it had dropped by something like 40%, the belief in religion or the following of religion. Do you believe those reports did a huge amount of damage to religion in Ireland from what your experience from going around to the churches?
I think Ireland is doing a lot of things. If you look at how Ireland modernised it, it sort of did it at twice the speed. Everything Ireland has done, modernisation, embracing sort of Sunday shopping and all that, we're anxious to catch up. And I think the secularism that we experience in Ireland, we did like 20 years of secularisation that would take 20 years elsewhere in 10 years or in 5 years. But I think we're at an interesting point now, because you see, we still have our Catholic funerals. That's the one thing that has survived. People
it's more traditional, really, isn't it? It's like weddings. It's like
I think I would disagree with you. I think it's more than wedding. I think confirmations, communions, and so on. That's just sort of, they want the day out. That's what they remember. They want to. They don't want. The attitude is people don't want to deprive their child of that day out, and obviously all the cash and so on. But there's no deeper, I think,
but
spiritual
the
meaning.
Funerals
Whereas with funerals, I've been to a family funeral recently, and I just recall just how well Ireland does that. It's just this moment where people pause, and people are struggling with, what do I believe? Is that it? Is that not it? Just to give yourself, even if it's just an hour whenever somebody dies, I think it's quite healthy. And I mean, in my book, I describe myself as a grappling Catholic. I think if I'd stayed in Ireland and had to experience all this full on, I would have run screaming a long time ago. I haven't quite given up in it, but I don't quite know what I haven't given up on. And my book was literally was a niggle in me. I said, we're trying to just sort of run away from something. And I said, before I part from this, I need to know what was going on. And I think a lot of people my age, I'm 46 now, and a lot of people I went to school with got in touch with me over this, when I wrote this book, and they said, you know what? I've got kids now, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do now. I mean, I don't really want to do that whole Irish Catholic thing again, but I'm not sure what's the alternative. What do I give them else? I want to give them something, some sort of moral compass to get through their lives and so on. And it's a very complicated time for them, but I think it's also quite a healthy time, because we're maturing. We have to make decisions for ourselves. You can't just go once a week to a church, open your mouth, and somebody will just ladle some gloop in, and that's your Sunday obligation done. Off you go. I think people will now have to make choices. How do you live as an ethical person in 21st century Ireland? What do I believe in? If it's not the Catechism of the Catholic Church, well, what is it then? And I think that's very healthy. We should have had that a long time ago, because it encourages people to think for themselves. And I think a lot of people were quite happy not thinking for themselves, because Catholicism is all about the priest on high telling you what to think and what to believe. And I think people have just rebelled against that, and I would say about time.
The argument, just finally before we wrap up, the arguments more recently has been in relation to separating church and state. When it comes to education, for example, is one of the primary arguments. Should we remove the sacraments, confirmation, communion, which has been suggested to remove them out of schools, in the school setting? And also, should we remove religion as an obligatory subject for primary school? Do you believe, because it is essentially indoctrination, so should that be similar to the United States, where in public schools they don't teach a particular religion because it would be considered to be discrimination? They would teach theocracy, all right, or theology, should I say?
Yeah.
So, do you believe we should remove religion from schools?
Oh, I think so. It should all have been gone a long time ago. I liken religion lessons in our schools a bit like Irish lessons. We're locked in a room and we're taught for how many years? 6, 12. At least 12 years, and yet we know nothing. Many people emerge with very little Irish and very little understanding of it. So you do wonder, what are they? They have a captive audience, and they're still not able to get it into our brains in any shape or form. Most people don't actually know what being Catholic means. That's what the book is, me going on that journey, trying to find out for myself. And I think many people, 40-somethings, we got these religion books that didn't explain anything. So yes, I'm all in favour of it going out of schools. Many people in the Catholic Church think it also needs to get out, because we're doing nobody any favours. We're perhaps even turning turning people against even the idea of embracing something like spirituality or something later in life, because we're giving them this very banal version in the classroom. So I think it should be out. Interestingly, one of my old schoolmates from St. Paul's in Raheny, he was behind the campaign to drop the baptism ban, that you had to be baptized to get into a school with a Catholic
That's
ethos.
right, yeah.
So steps are being taken, but interestingly, a lot of parents are pushing
Taking
back.
time, isn't it? I mean, if you go
Yeah,
right back
but
to Rory
interestingly,
Quinn, when
he
he was
said-
Minister for Education, he said we wanted to get rid of it, but it never happened. Mind you, he was an atheist too.
Sorry, go in.
Rory Quinn at the time when he was Minister
Yeah.
for Education, he said we should get rid of
Yeah,
it.
but
That's gone back 10 years ago.
It's fascinating how oftentimes people propose these things, and many Irish people push back against it. I was talking to somebody today, and they were saying, they were talking about a school that was a Catholic school, and there was talk of turning it into an Educate Together school. The parents pushed back against it. I can't remember which school it was. So don't underestimate the Irish people clinging to certain parts of their Catholic identity, because they have always had power. We always knew that, but it suits our narrative to present ourselves in our recent past as helpless children who were being abused collectively by priests and nuns. And I'm just gently suggesting in the book that I think we all know, we were there. Everyone knows for themselves how much power or lack of power they had, what they saw or didn't see. And if we want to move on and grow up as a nation, I think we need to cop on and realise that it wasn't just some sort of Irish Catholic horror story with these monster priests doing terrible things to us.
Fintan O'Toole described the book as an extraordinary story, at once intimate and epic. This is a landmark book, and I know it was shortlisted for non-fiction book of the year in the Irish Book Awards in 2021. It's called The Best Catholic in the World. And Derek, I have to have a read of it actually, because it intrigues me now after listening to you for the last 20 minutes. So I will have a read.
I'm not
of it
attacking anyone in the book. Anyone who thinks it's heavy going, I'm literally just, I'm just quite sad, but hopeful that we can actually emerge from this.
Are you the best Catholic in the world now yourself?
Oh,
Or do
no, you
try
go to
be?
Poland. I've just come back from Poland. The best Catholics in the world are now in Poland. I will hand over the crown officially next time I'm back.
Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio, the multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.